Hi, and thank you for joining us for this important conversation around voting rights and accessible voting. I'm Kristen Stevenson, MDA's Executive Vice President and Chief Advocacy and Care Services Officer, and I'm honored today to be joined by the Senior United States Senator from Pennsylvania, Bob Casey. Senator Casey is a longtime ally of the disability community and sponsor of the Accessible Voting Act. Senator Casey, we're honored to have you here with us as we talk about this important issue today.
Kristen, great to be with you, and thanks to MDA for this opportunity.
Today's conversation is part of MDA's Advocacy Institute. This monthly series provides advocates with grassroots skills, timely news on issues that are important to the neuromuscular community, and updates from the U.S. Congress and federal agencies. If you're interested in becoming a part of future advocacy institutes, please visit the URL you see on your screen and sign up to be part of the Advocacy Network. Now, on to our topic today. Elections, as we know, are a fundamental component of democracy, and we're fortunate to live in a society where we have the right to vote. And today we're discussing voting and voting rights, including accessible voting, so that individuals understand their rights when it comes time to cast their ballot this November. As a reminder, as a 501c3 nonprofit organization, the Muscular Dystrophy Association is a nonpartisan organization, and we're sharing this information as a resource for the community and to encourage everyone to vote, regardless of your political persuasion. Now, Senator Casey, let's dive in. For our first question, we'd love to know if you could just share with us a little bit about your history of advocacy on behalf of individuals living with disabilities and how you got involved in this work.
Well, Kristen, I think like a lot of people, it starts with often your own family. In my case, my parents, who were both, my father was involved in public service in the state of Pennsylvania. My mother, of course, was helping him where she could, but raising 8 children. So they were busy, but they always instilled in us a sense of obligation to do what you could to help those around you. And my mother would often say, count your blessings. So when there are others around you that need help or that can benefit from your assistance in one way or another, you should try to get involved where you can. Obviously, ultimately that meant for me public service, but they were having that influence on us long before I thought about running for public office.
Next question, which is a little bit about the history of accessible voting and what about that history really compelled you to introduce the Accessible Voting Act. And I'm wondering if it's some combination of this kind of deep dive into the existing realities along with a kind of a belief that policy can be improved over time.
Well, the battles on voting and access to the vote are about as old as our republic. And we know that every time we think we've made enough progress or we've advanced the right to vote, we're reminded that there's still more work to do. I think a lot of Americans probably thought after the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965 that we had come to the end of the track, so to speak. But of course, that's not true, and that's certainly not true in terms of the work we still must do for Americans with disabilities. The act itself, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, has a Title II, which requires 2 levels of government, state and local government, to ensure that people with disabilities have full and equal access to the opportunity to vote, or I should say a full and equal opportunity to vote. We know as well that, I guess maybe 12 years later, the Help America Vote Act was passed, and it required jurisdictions responsible for conducting federal elections to provide at least one accessible voting system for people with disabilities at each polling place in federal elections. And of course, that was a strong piece of legislation, but we got to make sure that every election has, or I should say, every person with a disability has an opportunity to vote in every election, whether it's federal elections like the United States House of Representatives, United States Senate, President and Vice President. But of course, we've got a lot of other offices to vote on for state and local government. So we don't have nearly enough funding. We've got a patchwork of laws. So that's why I introduced with Senator Amy Klobuchar of the state of Minnesota the Accessible Voting Act a number of months ago now. It's Senate Bill 3206, 3206. Here's what it would do, among other provisions. Maybe just give you 5 quick examples. Number one, establish the Office of Accessibility within the Election Assistance Commission to support and oversee state efforts to expand voter accessibility and serve as a resource for both voters as well as advocates. Number two, establish a new state grant program for the Office of Accessibility to administer for the improvement of accessibility uh, when registering to vote, or when you're voting by absentee ballot, or when you're casting a ballot in person. Number three, provide up to date voting information and resources. Number four, expand the number of options to cast a vote in federal elections, whether that's voting by mail or voting in person, or ensuring voters with disabilities can utilize the voting option that's most accessible to them. And then fifth of this part of the bill, create a national resource center on accessible voting to conduct cultural competency training for election officials and poll workers to create truly accessible voting systems. So we've got to get this bill passed. We're not there yet. I wish I could tell you it's going to pass in the next few weeks. That's not likely because there's not a lot of legislative time left between now and election day. So we're going to have work to do before this upcoming election and a lot more work after, but we're going to keep pushing it forward.
So thank you for giving us some highlights about what we could potentially anticipate kind of for a future state. And I think that it kind of brings me to the next question, which is what, in terms of going to the polls this November with our current set of rules and requirements, what accommodations would be required to be in place in a polling site to ensure that individuals living with disabilities are able to cast their ballots?
Well, I'll go back to the ADA. That law requires that a person with a disability has both a full and an equal opportunity to vote. The Help America Act that I mentioned from 2002 requires every polling place to provide an accessible voting system for people with disabilities, as I indicated. It must provide the same level of privacy and independence that other voters receive. And I mentioned both privacy and independence before. And I'll go back even further. The Voting Rights Act of '65, as I mentioned earlier, requires election officials to allow a voter with a disability to receive assistance from a person of the voter's choice.
And I appreciate that summary also. And one of the things that you touched on that I think is really important that our community would be particularly interested in thinking about is this right to have someone give you assistance at the polling place. And that is something that would be fundamentally essential for many people that the Muscular Dystrophy Association serves to be able to actually execute the vote. And so I think as a takeaway that is of utmost importance is understanding that every individual voting does have that right under the current rules, and that's something that they could, I would presume, ask anyone who is a official overseeing the polling location to be able to allow them to take advantage of. Is that correct?
Yeah, and this is the kind of year where we're going to have to pay close attention, not just to federal legislation or federal requirements, but pay really close attention to what happens at the state level in terms of voting. And I mean, I think it's important to walk through some of those kind of broad guideposts. One of them is pay close attention to your state's election law and what the rules are, because there is some variety between and among states. States will have different laws, different elements of what folks have to become familiar with. in terms of voting. And we're at a point now in our nation's development on voting is that pretty much the nation overall has some kind of mail-in voting, but it varies. There are a few states, for example, the state of Oregon for a good while now, and also the state of Utah offer universal mail-in voting, and they mail a ballot to every registered voter. So the voter in those states doesn't have to do anything initially. They receive the ballot, and then the ballot can be sent out by them, sent back in the mail. But states like the state of Pennsylvania, the state I represent, are a little different. I think this is probably more common than the Oregon or Utah example. But in Pennsylvania and states like it, you're provided an opportunity for any voter who wishes to request a mail-in ballot. So you have to initiate it. You have to request it, almost exactly like the old absentee ballot. In the old days, meaning before in Pennsylvania, before the law changed in 2019 to be implemented in 2020. So we're, even without COVID-19 and the challenge of helping people to vote safely, Pennsylvania was going to change this system anyway. But under the old law, if you were going to be out of town or away from your county on election day, you had to, many weeks in advance, request a ballot. So you had to fill out a form, send it in, and they would send you back an absentee ballot. You would fill that out and send it in. So this is very similar to that. Some people have called mail-in balloting in Pennsylvania no excuse absentee balloting, meaning that it's the same process, largely the same as an absentee ballot process, but you don't need an excuse to get the ballot. The old excuse was, I'm not going to be in the county, I'm out of town on business or some personal obligation. But now you have to request the ballot. So many states have expanded that kind of mail-in voting as a way to reduce in-person voting and person-to-person interactions at the polling place because of COVID-19. There are still some states that require an excuse as to why a voter can't vote in person. So there's still some states that operate now the way Pennsylvania operated up through 2019. So you have to check your state law and check the requirements. So voters can send the ballots back in the mail in most states, and many states allow voters who can also drop off a completed ballot that they may have gotten the ballot after requesting it, but instead of putting it back in the mail, you can go to a drop box in some states. You can also go to an election office. So you request the ballot, you get it back, you fill it out, and instead of dropping it in the mail, you're in your local community and there's a county election office. You could drop it off there or in a drop box. And these are usually just almost like mailboxes, but they have a different look than a mailbox, and they will indicate clearly that it's a drop box for a ballot. And they, in most, if not every instance, will have 24-hour security, either some kind of security guard or some kind of surveillance camera. So it's just important to become familiar with whether your state has one form or another. In Pennsylvania, we've got a couple of options. Now, some states actually offer early in-person voting. So you can go to a location, in essence a polling place, and walk in and vote as if you're voting on election day, but it's days or sometimes weeks early. So you just have to be cognizant of what's happening in your state and in your county. But I think the watchword here is check, or the phrase is check the rules.
Yes.
And we're going to be given information about how to do that.
That's great. Yeah, I think it's incredibly important to understand that there is not only this level of federal protection and rights that are associated with the legislation that you mentioned that is current law, but really understanding the way your state operates would be essential in being able to execute your ability to vote in a timely manner to make sure your vote counts, and to make sure that you don't have any unexpected challenges when you do go to vote, regardless of what modality you take advantage of. And I believe one of the sites where folks can go and look for information on that is vote.gov. And I'm sure that each state also has resources available on their state web pages as well. And it seems that probably the earlier folks can check into that and make sure they understand what the opportunity is and what their rights are and what the modalities are, probably the better. Would you agree?
Definitely. And as you mentioned, vote.gov is one place to go. Obviously, you can go to your state election office or a state election director. Counties have information as well. I think the key, though, if you're going to those sites, is make sure you get to the official site, not an advertisement that takes you down a different road. Sometimes the first entries when you're searching can be a little misleading because they're advertisements. And once you get to the state's official website for voting in Pennsylvania, we call it the Department of State, unlike the Washington Department of State, which deals with foreign policy. In Pennsylvania, the Department of State is the state government agency that deals with voting. In other states, they might have the same name, but it might have a different name. But there are lots of ways to get there. Vote.gov is one. Another one is usa.gov/voting. So that gives you information about how to register, how to cast a ballot. There are others as well. I'll just give you a few more. There are some non-governmental organizations dedicated to providing access to information and assistance at the polls. Even some media organizations have put information up on television. A partnership of several organizations runs, this is a little longer word, but healthyvoting, one word, .org, healthyvoting.org, to help you find information about both safety and accessibility.
Thank you, Senator Casey. And I think having that explicit direction to help folks navigate the many, many, many hits they will get when they Google this information is really helpful. And for everyone watching today, we will also have links on the MDA.org landing pages to some of these sites that have reliable information that Senator Casey just referenced. It can be really challenging. You're right, going through a Google search and trying to differentiate between what are sort of advertising and paid services as opposed to what are more of the public focused services. And so having some of those direct links would be very helpful. So Senator Casey, we so much appreciate your time, and I know that we are coming near the end of our time together, and would love to just ask you as we are wrapping up here today. I know this is kind of a basic question, but it's one that maybe deserves a little bit of attention, and it's one that, fundamentally brings us back to why this all matters, and would love to get your thoughts on why it's important to vote from your standpoint.
Well, I think the obvious answer, which everyone knows, is voting ultimately affects public policy. We know that, whether you're voting for a local office, a county office, a state, or a federal office. But I think especially when it comes to, frankly, disability issues. We talked earlier about how we've made advancements over time, especially with the Americans with Disabilities Act, but there's still work to do to meet the goals of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and there's a lot of work to do when it comes to making voting completely accessible for people with disabilities.
Like you, I would encourage everyone to vote. Regardless of your political persuasion, regardless of your preferences, please vote. It's the only way that our democracy can thrive in its most vital way. And would love to thank everyone for joining us today for this MDA Advocacy Institute. And thank you to Senator Casey for all of the work you're doing to support the community and for your commitment to accessible voting. We appreciate it.
Kristen, thank you, and MDA.
If you've not done so already, please consider signing up to be an MDA advocate. You'll receive timely updates on issues of importance to the neuromuscular community and will alert you to opportunities to advocate on behalf of passage of important legislation that impacts you. You'll also receive information on how to join our next Advocacy Institute session. So in conclusion, would just remind everyone to please register to vote. If you're not registered to vote, get registered. And once you are, make a plan to vote and then follow through. And don't forget to check on your state and local rules to make sure you are ready to go for your vote to count. Thank you again for joining. Thank you again, Senator Casey, and look forward to our next Advocacy Institute.